Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Judy Lloyd and I am the Fall Fellow for the Dole Institute of Politics. Here today with my good friend Lydia Beebe, and I'll tell you a little bit about her, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about our program. I'm doing a program called First in Their Class. It's about authentic women and the originality that got them there. And each of my guests is an authentic woman that has some original story. And Lydia is going to tell hers today coming from McPherson, Kansas, and rising up the ladder to be the highest ranking and first woman officer of the Chevron Corporation, which is quite a thing. Next week I have a guest who is going to be here next Tuesday, the 20th at noon. Her name is Lisa Gable. She is the former ambassador to the World Expo in Japan. Also was a presidential appointee during President Ronald Reagan. And she's going to talk about the things that you do that you have to do sometimes when adversity faces you and zigzagging through your life. Things that, how do you stay fresh and how do you stay strong even under adverse circumstances. On November 3rd, I have a very special guest coming out from the White House. Her name is Ellie Schaefer. And she is the woman that nobody knows. They don't know her name, but she's probably one of the most consequential women in the White House, special assistant to the president, and she directs the White House Visitor's Office. So she's going to talk about what it's like to choreograph every move of President Obama and what it's like to receive the Pope at the White House and all kinds of great things. She's a fabulous guest. On November 10th, I have Congresswoman Ellen Tauscher, a 10-term congresswoman from California, who also served as the Undersecretary of State under Hillary Clinton. So she's going to talk about her perceptions of what she's been through in her life, as well as does she think that Hillary will be the first woman president? So that will be fascinating. And then my last guest is on November 17th, and that's Donna Lucas. And Donna Lucas was the former Deputy Chief of Staff to Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor, and the Chief of Staff to Maria Shriver when she was First Lady in California. And she's going to talk about the convergence of media and Hollywood and politics, and probably touch a little bit on our favorite shows like Scandal and House of Cards and stuff like that, how much of that's for real and how much of that's for play. But today I'm really honored. I have my friend Lydia Beebe here. She was just commenting, we've known each other 20 years.
More or less.
More or less.
Give or take.
Give or take, that's right. And before I introduce you, I want to welcome our provost today. Jeff Vitter is here. Thank you so much for being with us. And our Institute Director, Bill Lacey, is here with us. Lydia Beebe is one of the most unique and authentic women I've ever met, and I've known her for many years. She began at Chevron as a contracts attorney in 1977, serving as a senior manager and attorney in their tax department. She worked on the House side of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., doing tax work for Chevron, 1981 to 85. And she rose through the ranks to become corporate secretary, chief governance officer, and the first woman officer of the company. She was also an appointee of both President George W. Bush to the Presidio Trust, which she'll talk a little bit about, and Governor Pete Wilson to the Fair Employment Housing Commission, where she was recognized as a civil rights hero. She serves on the advisory board of the Arthur and Tony Rember Rock Center of Corporate Governance at Stanford, and the advisory board of the John Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance, University of Delaware, governing board of the San Francisco Symphony, and right here on the governing board at the KU Endowment Association and the KU Law Alumni. And I know we've got some of her law friends here, so it's wonderful to have you all here today. She holds a Juris Doctorate from the University of Kansas School of Law, BA in Journalism from the University of Kansas, and serves currently as Senior of Counsel in San Francisco at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, which is an expert in corporate law and governance. She has received countless awards: Advancement of Justice Award from the National Judicial College, the Civil Rights Hero, as I mentioned, from the state of California, the Breakthrough Award and Lifetime Achievement Award, Professional and Business Women of California, and Corporate Secretary of the Year and Lifetime Achievement in Corporate Governance, Corporate Secretary Magazine. So please join me, if you would, in welcoming Lydia Beebe. Well,
thanks for the long, lengthy introduction, Judy. It cuts down on the stories I have to tell.
It's one of those things, Lydia, where you're so accomplished, it's very difficult to not recognize everything that you've done.
Sweet.
So we talked about you started in McPherson, Kansas. And I know that, how you grew up and your life story is something that led you on the pathway to become the highest ranking woman at Chevron. So tell us a little bit about your life story.
I was born in Lynchburg, Kansas, just in case anyone's interested in that, in the Lynchburg Hospital. Lived in Inman through second grade and moved to McPherson, where I was a debater in high school and got into journalism. Went to summer camp in debate, I think, at KU, and came to KU because my parents had both gone to the University of Kansas Law School, and that was kind of like that Blind Side movie, kind of the family school. I was here 7 years, 7 really fun years. I loved KU. I decided when I graduated from law school I wanted to be from Kansas. Drove my Pinto to California to seek fame and fortune, and there I still seek. But I did, I stumbled into this job at Chevron very early on, and I called my father and asked him, I said, well, what do you think about this? Do you think I should take this job, or should I look around a little bit more? He's like, take that job. You can always look for another one later. And so I did, as you mentioned, start out doing, transaction law and contracts and stuff in the land part of Chevron, but I thought it was really boring. And so I looked around and I thought, I met a friend of a friend who was married to a guy that was a tax lawyer at Chevron, and he convinced me that tax law was the place to be because there you didn't have to refer all the good work to outside counsel. You really actually kept the work. So I said, okay, I'm going to be a tax lawyer. And I had taken tax from Martin, so I thought I had a good background. I marched over and met the head of the tax league, the tax law group, and I said, I want to work for you. And he said, oh, we'd love to have somebody, kind of aspirational like you, but you don't have a master's in tax, so you have to get a master's in tax. But he said they offer one right over here at Golden Gate. So I said, okay, I'll be back. So I started taking night classes, went over there. In the meantime, I got an opportunity to go to be a legislative analyst in the government affairs group in Chevron. I thought, well, that might be more interesting than what I'm doing, so I did that. And I think that's where I kind of figured out that the part of law that was most interesting to me was the intersection of law and public policy. And I enjoyed my year and a half in government affairs as an analyst quite a bit. I went to Washington, D.C. on a training week and spent some time learning about lobbying. And before the last afternoon I was there, I went in to see the head of that group, and I said, this has been a really good week. I'd like to work for you. And he said, well, this is a development job, maybe someday. So I came back, got my master's in tax, went to the tax department. I worked there a year, not even a year and a half, but I had a really a good start in tax, and then I got the call from the Washington, D.C. guy, and he said, come on, we need you. And so I was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for 4 years, and really enjoyed that. Fascinating experience. Worked a lot on tax issues, upstream access issues, met a lot of people, and so came back. My oldest child was actually born in Washington, D.C., and I kind of decided we needed to have a kind of more of a settled upbringing than the life of Washington, so I moved back, and so I spent 10 years as a tax lawyer working along in the trenches, and finally became a little bit of a management position there, and one day I got the call to go up and see the chairman, and I thought, well, isn't this interesting? But he asked me if I would be willing to be the corporate secretary, and so it's kind of like it's a behind-the-scenes job. My good friend Dan Stanley, that I mentioned Bill earlier, who was my debate colleague in my first year at KU, he worked for many years for Senator Dole in his office as an administrative assistant, and he used to describe his job, if you asked him what he did, he'd say, well, nobody ever sees what I do, but I have a great seat. And that's kind of what I think about the corporate secretary's role in a corporation. Nobody really knows what you do, it's all behind the scenes, but you have a great seat. But I did have the privilege of being the first woman officer, and I stayed in that role for 20 years and retired in April. So that's a thumbnail of my life story, and now I'm reinventing myself and seeking fame and fortune somewhere else.
Well, we had a long chat last night, which I really enjoyed, and I learned that you had lost your mother when you were only 18 years old. And so, I wonder, what impact that your mother's lessons had on you, and did you have other female role models in Chevron as you were moving up, or were you kind of paving your own way?
Oh, well, those are hard questions. Of course, everybody, you know, a mother is an influential position to most all of us, and I think my mother was to me. She was certainly well educated. She had a teaching degree, a law degree, and a master's in you know, library science. Her mother had gone to Bethany College in Lindsborg. When she was a youngster, they lived out on a farm outside of Lindsborg, and then when the girls there were 4 girls in that family, when they got kind of, you know, through whatever the local school was, their mother, whose name was Lydia, wanted to move into town so the girls could go to Bethany College, because of course they weren't going to go off to the university. But so I came from a family that believed in education. I really do think that's been one of the things that has helped me a lot through life, is just being a willingness, trying to be a constant learner, trying to have a willingness to learn something new, you know, looking at an opportunity to do something different as an opportunity to learn more. So I think I learned a lot from her. She was pretty determined, stubborn. Everybody of that stock is stubborn, so my kids would all say, you know, they come by it naturally. You know, I don't know. Role models, I did want to mention. One of the people, there were no real Chevron executives to be a role model, but one of the people I looked up to and was fortunate enough to have a close relationship is Carla Hills, who was in the cabinet, as you know, for a couple Republican presidents, but served on the Chevron board for a time when I first was there, and then had come back on the board after being in the cabinet, and was on the board when I started in that role. And I have to say, I had when I was, I think it was 1978, when I was just at Chevron a year, when she spoke to a group of women employees at Chevron. And I didn't really think much about it. I didn't know much about her, but she was very impressive. And I remember her talking to that group about when she was pregnant, working at a law firm, and how she didn't want anyone to know it. And she put a rubber band in her skirt and had a big boxy blazer on and didn't tell anyone she was pregnant. And I thought, well, I didn't even want kids at the time. I didn't think much about it. But I'll tell you what, when I decided, some years later to have kids, I thought, well, that was probably a good idea. People don't take you as seriously if they know you're pregnant. I didn't say anything to anyone until it was more than obvious. She is my epitome, I think, and she and her husband, who I also got to know, they were both dedicated to their family. They have 4 kids. But they had these great careers, and they were just a delight to know. And so they were always my epitome of a working couple and how to make a working family work.
Well, and you've done that as well. I know I've met your husband, Chuck, who's awesome. He used to be a senior counsel to Senator Cassabaum here in Kansas, or he worked in D.C., right?
He worked in D.C., he worked for Nancy Cassabaum.
But you met him here at KU.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, we met my last year at KU. Just as I was leaving, going out, I was graduating. We only dated for a short time in my last year, but we, I was going to California, and so we continued to date. We actually got married right a year later. He said he'd come to California, so we got married and have been married ever since, But he had a wonderful job when we were in Washington, D.C. He worked for Nancy Cassabaum first on her personal staff, and then over on the aviation subcommittee, and then when she became chair of the aviation subcommittee, he got to be majority counsel there, and so it was a nice experience, and that led him to United Airlines, where he spent 23 years, and a nice opportunity for us to see the world, and we continue to do that.
That's great. Well, talk a little bit, if you would, about I know you're a family that you're life partners together, and he helped you share a lot of the burden while you were moving up the corporate ladder. Talk a little bit about your kids and some of the things he did to help.
Well, he did whatever he had to do. Whatever else. I don't know. I decided early on you couldn't really spend your life nagging or begging somebody else to do something, so you had to do what you were willing to do and just stop and see what else other people would do. But no, we have 3 children. They're 27, 29, and 31 now. All wonderful children in my eyes. And I do believe that kids of working parents grow up independent because they have to. People would ask me when I went back to work how I got my kids to sleep through the night. I'd say, well, they just had to because I don't wake up, you know. And so, but it is, we had a lot of benefits. We were old enough and had good enough jobs that we could afford in-home care. You know, I always, if I had a crowd of students, which I thought might be here, you know, I always think you have to, you know, spend as much as you can afford to spend to have help, because that's the only way you can really stay engaged in your job. But most of you all have figured that out by now, so I don't need to talk too much about my experience in raising kids. But he definitely, I don't know how he learned that, because his family wasn't that way, but mine either. But it was kind of evident, I guess, to both of us that we both had to pitch in to get it done. And he's been a good sport ever since. He even took up cooking after he retired from United. So now I don't even have to go in the kitchen.
You do the dishes, though?
No. But we have 2 dishwashers. We're so spoiled. We have 2 dishwashers in our kitchen just to keep us going.
Well, I know civic engagement is very important to you, and I want to get to your appointments, but first I want to ask you a question. You had talked to me about the first time you got to meet Senator Dole.
Oh, that's a good story. I was actually, when I was a high school senior, I was an editor in the high school paper, and so this would be 1969, and he'd just been elected to the Senate, you know, in the last year or so, and he came to my hometown for some political event. And so somehow the journalism teacher knew this and arranged for myself and one of the other editors to go do an interview of him at this event. And you know, I was pretty naive, you know. You know, what you see is what you get. We go over to these people's house, and I knew the people, and they, you know, had a store downtown, you know, went to church just like everyone else, and they were serving cocktails in that party. And I was just shocked, because that's just nothing I had really seen at home, you know. So the people, you know, the adults around the room, all of whom you knew, all had a drink, and you'd never really exactly been in the form that they had a drink. But I can still remember what I wore, but I sat down on the couch there and interviewed Senator Dole, and he seemed like a very, you know, warm, authentic person. You know, one thing that you do notice when you first meet him, and that we talked about, I'm sure I knew that he had been injured in the war, but I didn't really know what that meant, and the fact that he always shook hands with his left hand and had that pencil in his right hand because his arm was injured. You know, you just learn those things a little bit more up close and personal. But he was a really striking, good-looking man, so I remember thinking that too. I have no idea what we talked about.
Maybe we'll have to look back in in your school archives and see if we can find that interview.
I looked this weekend. I dug around in the attic looking in my old boxes, but I didn't find anything really juicy, so you're going to have to wait until another year.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your civic engagement. I know you were appointed by Governor Pete Wilson to the Fair Employment Housing Commission, also by President Bush to the Presidio Trust. How did that help or hurt your career? Sometimes corporations like people to be involved in politics and policy, and other times they're not quite as fond of it.
You know, it is an interesting thing to think about. You know, Pete Wilson was elected governor in 1990, and I had come back from Washington in 1985, but I knew a lot of people I'd kept up with from Washington, and some from his staff. And so then when they all turned up in Sacramento, all these people that had worked from the California delegation, I kept in touch with them. And so then they came around and, you know, had all these, you know, boards and things to appoint people to. And I decided that would be a nice thing to do. I'd like to be on some, you know, cush board where you got to opine on, you know, economic policy or something. And I really, you know, expressed interest in this because I kind of felt like I was, you know, working away in the trenches, but I'd had 3 kids. I didn't feel like I'd been rising as fast as some of the guys, and I kind of wanted to just do something. I was pretty happy with what I was doing, and I needed the job and the steady, you know, career for my family, but I wanted to do something more to add interest, you know, kind of satisfaction maybe to my life. Just kind of make it a little bit more, I don't know, have some other outlet rather than the internal corporation. And so I expressed an interest in a few things, but they didn't come along. And then one day I get this call about whether I would be willing to be appointed to the Fair Employment and Housing Commission. And I said, oh, no, I don't know anything about employment law. That's not in my area. That's not in my bailiwick. No, I don't want to do that. So then a week or two later, I get the call. My friend says, Lydia, I think you should think about this. I think you'd be good at this. You're passionate about equal rights for women. You'd enjoy this. And I still, I don't think so. That sounds like a lot of work, and really, I'm not sure it's my thing. And she said, well, let me explain it to you this way, Lydia. This is what we need now. And if you want to do something for the Wilson administration, we need this now. And if you do this, maybe you can move to something else later. I said, okay, now that you've explained it, I'd love to do that. And so, so I said I would. And so then you go ahead and have these interviews. And then it got down to it. And so then I get this call, oh, we'd like to appoint you, but we need a recommendation from Chevron, just because the governor doesn't want to upset Chevron. So I said, oh, okay, let me look into this. So then I called one of my political friends, and I said, okay, what does this need to say? I thought I'd have, Joe Blow, my best friend over here who I used to work for, I think he could write a nice letter. And she said, well, I'm sure he could, but, you really need a letter from the chairman, from the CEO. I said, well, he's not going to write me a letter. I barely know the man. And she said, Lydia, here's how it's done. You go back to your office and write a very nice letter of recommendation about yourself, and then you just ask him if he would sign it. I said, really? Oh, yeah, that's what you have to do. So I went back to my office. I wrote a very lovely letter about myself. But I was into, had been oriented into the Chevron way at that time, and so I knew I couldn't just send it up to the chairman. So I went dutifully to the head of the tax department, and I put this little buck slip to, from John, the tax guy, to Ken, the CEO, and said, this would be very good for Lydia. It would be a good development assignment, and would you please sign this recommendation? And I asked him to sign this buck slip up to the chairman. And he read this, and he looked at me, and he said, do you really want to do this? And I said, I think so. I think it'd be very interesting. Okay, so he signed it. So about 3 days later, he comes in, and he puts this letter in front of me, and he says, what do you want me to do with this letter anyway? And he throws it down on my desk, and it's signed by the chairman. And then on that buck slip, he crosses it off, his name, and puts an arrow back to John, and he says, John, good letter, Ken. And so I did that, and I actually found I loved it. I mean, the good thing about this, it really was an opportunity to learn a new area of the law. I didn't know anything about employment law, housing law, and I think it restored some of my self-confidence that you could actually learn something new and be respected for being at least fluent in it in a relatively short amount of time. We did a lot of regulatory work, and I was done a lot of regulatory work in the tax department, so I was willing to get in there and read all the proposed regulations for the California civil rights laws and make suggestions on what the regulations this commission issued, what they should be. So I became the chair of the regulations subcommittee right away because they knew that if I got that job, I would actually read it. And so then I became chair of that commission within a few years, and I didn't really do it to improve my position at Chevron. I did it mostly to have some other satisfaction or some other outlet. But I think that appointment and the fact that I was successful at it changed the image and the impression that the Chevron executives had of me. I mean, I think that was instrumental in the chairman deciding that I should be, the first woman officer. And so I always tell that story because I do think one of my strategies that has helped me in life is that, if you want something to change, well, change something, do something different, and you can figure out what it is, and it may have the intended consequence, or it may not. But I think it was an insightful experience for me, and I think it did change a little bit the course of my career. So I enjoyed it very much, and still have very good friends from that experience.
It's interesting you would mention kind of that they tapped you for something that you didn't think you had the expertise for. I had the same thing happen during the Schwarzenegger administration where they asked me to serve on the Coastal Commission.
Well, that's a good assignment.
That's a good one. And I said, I don't know anything about what the Coastal Commission does. I know there's a lot of permitting and regulation. And they said, well, do you like the coast? I said, yeah. You like the environment? Yeah. Okay, you're our gal. And it turns out, they do a lot of vetting before they actually ask you to consider things like this. And then they put you through the ringer, which is, okay, now you got to go find people to go recommend you to do this, which becomes your next challenge because you have to think about, well, wait a minute, what are they going to say about me that puts me in line for that? You've been and do you want to talk at all about the Presidio?
Well, the Presidio was another interesting experience. It was one of those things that I actually didn't seek that one. I got the call, again, from some friends that I'd had for many years that recommended me. And by this time I've had, kind of middle-aged anyway, and I get this call from somebody that I think was about 22 years old working in White House personnel. Did I want this? Would I take this? Would I be interested? And I'm like, well, what do they do? And then the next question I ask, wise as I was, when do they meet? And this young man tells me, oh, well, let's see. They meet, I think it looks like about 3 times a year, and it's all in the evening. I said, oh, I can do that. Well, actually, that turned out to be only the public hearings they had. The meetings were entirely different, which was a whole different story. But I went home, and I was talking to my husband about that, and I said, this sounds very interesting, but I don't really know anything about public land. The Presidio had been a military operation, and it had been converted into a national park that was supposed to be economically self-sufficient in 15 years. And so this board was appointed to oversee the administration of the trust and the monetization of some of the buildings and the assets they had in order to provide the revenue to pay for the conservation and the national park stuff in the Presidio. So it was interesting kind of business public partnership that I thought would be a good thing to do, but it really, again, didn't have much to do with my career, just whether you had the time to do it. And my husband said, well, those are some influential people on that board, too. And so it does, if you want to do it, it gives you a chance to meet a whole new group of people. And that was kind of, I weighed that, and I thought, well, that's actually a good thought. And I do, I have to say, I've mentioned several times, but another one of the things that has really helped me in life is friendships, relationships that you make with people and that you keep, and things that it opens so many doors. And I thought, well, that's a good group of people to know, and it certainly has been for a lot of reasons as you go through life, and just another opportunity to broaden your perspective.
Well, you've been such an amazing mentor to me on so many levels, and from the very first time that we met, I asked you, would you help me out? I was going in a lot of different directions, probably still am. And Lydia, you've always been there for me. And I remember reading shortly after you retired, Mary Frances, who replaced you. They asked her, she was in the San Francisco Business Times, and she had gotten one of the Women of Distinction awards. And they asked her who was her greatest mentor. And she said you, because you helped her to prepare and to be able to come up and be in the right place at the right time to replace you. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I tried to make Mary as very prepared as she could be, so I hope she's extremely successful. At some point in your life, you do realize that you are where you're going to be, at least at Chevron. You're at the career point where you're going to stay there as long as you want, but you're not going to get another job, and you have to decide what is the most satisfying thing about it, and really helping people, not just women, but probably predominantly women, because those are the people that always sought me out in Chevron. Helping them try to navigate and figure out what else they can do. That's always been very satisfying. Once you get to be a parent, your kids won't listen to you, so these other people might. But you do see a lot of people grow and get different experiences, so that the ability to help anybody is always, I think, the most satisfying.
Well, and you've always been a very honest person with your evaluation, and I think that's important because there's lots of people that I know who seek out a mentor, and the mentor will tell them all kinds of stuff, and they end up going in a direction and crash. And what I've always loved about you is you always find the pathway. What's your pathway? And if the pathway's not there, you're willing to say that too, and I think that's important.
See, my brother-in-law, if he were here, he would be laughing loudly now because he's the one that's always told the family, if you don't want to know what Lydia thinks, don't ask her, for God's sakes. But I do think that's one of those attributes you get from growing up in Kansas that I didn't learn a lot of spin. That was one of the things that other people in the corporation did. I think that's one of the reasons I stayed in tax for so long. You didn't have to have a lot of spin to be successful there. If you worked hard and were straightforward, they liked it. But I do think I tell people what I honestly think because when they ask me, I assume they want to know. It may not be true, but I always think they do.
So you were Chevron's most visible woman in the community for so many years, and because you were the first woman officer, there was a cachet there, and something that I think will always follow you. Did you consider mentoring other women, and did you consider being a role model to be part of your executive responsibility, or was that just something you did on your own?
That was an interesting thing. I was a little bit, when it was announced I was going to be corporate secretary, and then shortly after that I received that breakthrough award that you mentioned. And I actually got that award at a women's professional development conference where there were 2,000 women present, or 2,000 people, almost all women, and a couple hundred were Chevron. And there was such a huge roar of excitement from the crowd, and there was such an outpouring of, congratulations and excitement to me, and, letters and flowers and early emails, what we had in the day we called profs, I think. And it just really finally hit me that this was a really important thing to women in Chevron, and that I had always been an outspoken proponent for giving women equal opportunities. But if I wasn't that now, I was going to be letting a lot of people down. So I did kind of make an affirmative decision that I was going to be a voice for women's development and women's progression in Chevron. And so I remember going into our CEO, who was my boss at the time, and I told him, I said, we've talked a lot about diversity, but if we want to get to a diverse workplace, we can't just talk about it and then get from where we are to there. We're going to have to do a lot of steps along the way. He said, well, what do you mean? And so I'm like, well, we have to have some goals along the way, and we have to have some women's development programs, and we should support these things in the community, and here's some programs we could be involved in and things we could do to support it. And he said, okay, go ahead. And I'm like, what? What do you want me to do? And he said, whatever you think we should do. So I thought, okay. And I worked for a company that was profitable enough to have money to give away, and as an executive, you could get money if you had a good cause. So I did go out and do a lot of community things and try to put Chevron's name out in a lot of the women's areas, and try to be, and because I didn't have anyone else to turn to, try to be a face for Chevron in the community. And that was another great thing for me because it was very external focused, and when you're a corporate officer in a kind of behind the scenes job like I was, you don't get so many external opportunities. And I like people, I like to have a captive audience even. And so it really was another outlet for a lot of the things that I enjoyed and found satisfying. And so, and as we got more women in the ranks, I really tried hard to get more opportunities for other women and get women to follow in these different organizations. And that I spent my last 2 years at Chevron trying to line up people for all the men and women for all the different touch points I had in the community, because I thought it was important. And it's nice to see that happen.
Great. Well, we've talked a bit about civic engagement and its importance. A lot of women think that they can't. We talked about our first reaction to being appointed to something that was new was, oh, I'm not qualified, or oh, maybe this isn't for me. And I think a lot of women really do kind of study, things that you're asked to do, whether it's run for office, whether it's be appointed in office. And my point of view has always been it's great to have women involved because their perspective's completely different. I know when I worked for Bill Lacey on the Dole campaign, he loved to have women around because he said you think about things completely differently. So, you have any thoughts on women in civic engagement or any tips for anyone that's looking to kind of move up or do something politically?
Well, you got to follow your heart. I do think that women more than men, it's not 100%, but women more than men have self-doubt about whether they're qualified for anything, really. It's the next job. If you get offered a job, you're more likely to say, well, geez, can I do all that than if a guy gets offered a job. Again, not all across the board, but all the literature tells you that, and so you just have to kind of share that with people and help and have that, hope that insight helps people, reflect on maybe they can do that and do something different. I believe that you have to go, take the opportunities that life presents and try them. They may not be quite what you were looking for, but you should try it. I think I'm an example of that. I didn't really want to be the Fair Employment and Housing Commission chairman for the state of California, but when I was really excited to be that and did work very hard to do a credible job at that. And so you do have a lot of different opportunities. I'm happy to see more women get involved in politics because I think we really do need a diversity of opinion. In the corporate governance world, there's a lot of research that goes on about women serving on boards and how having at least 3 women is what the research shows creates a more of an open discussion and leads to a better result and leads to better. I don't know leads to, but certainly correlates to a better performing companies.
Well, so, this is kind of a unique cycle for the presidency in 2016. And, we've got on the left, we got Hillary, and on the right, we've got Carly, and we've got a whole bunch of other folks in between.
The farther left and the farther right.
Yes, that's right. You have any thoughts on the women that are running or anything you'd like to share?
Well, I think I'm happy to see them both out there. Of course, Hillary's been out there a long time, and she's, you're a Hillary fan or you're not. She comes with everybody knows her well and has had long experience with her. But it's nice that she's doing better today, so it's nice to see her, out there leading the pack. I actually think Carly is helping on the Republican side. I like Carly a lot. I think she's a genuine person. I've had the opportunity to know her, at least to some extent, in California, and she's very smart, very articulate, and I think she is raising the bar for some of the debate issues, and so I think it's good to have her out there. Part of me says she doesn't really have any qualifications to be president, and then there's part of me that says, well, geez, the United States was founded on these citizens out there that, did well in private life, that felt that it was their responsibility to go into public life. And so I'm more power to her if she's willing to get out there and give it a go.
She is fascinating, and Hillary is as well, both as candidates, and they do bring something completely different to the table. Important part of the discussion, I think.
Yeah, and many issues, women don't think any differently than men. It just, and not all women are the same too, that. But it is, it just brings a little bit of a different way of explaining.
Right, I think that's right. So you're still very active here at KU, and I know you're on the endowment, and you still participate in the law school, and you got a bunch of your law school friends here. What inspires you to kind of stay involved after now you're in California, you've been in Washington? What inspires you to stay involved, and what are the things that you're working on now?
Well, I think inspired. I just love KU, but it is. I told you that in the beginning. It's kind of a family school. My parents actually both went to KU Law School, and they met at KU Law School. And I'm sorry that my mother died before I really understood and heard all her stories about being one of 3 women in the class of 1949 and going to law school right after she served in the SPARS. But I do think Kansas, just like any other good state school, gives people a very good basis to have a productive life. And for whatever I learned at KU, it's gotten me to the point I have. And I had the great good fortune of working for a profitable corporation for many, many years that enabled me to have some resources. And I feel like that a lot of people get their start from a place like KU. And if we don't help it succeed and thrive, it's not going to. And as state's funding for schools becomes more and more difficult, it just seems more and more important for alumni to try to help. And so I have, gotten involved in the Endowment Association. And it's not just about raising money. It really is about being a champion in a lot of ways and being supportive. And I talk to a lot of students from KU that call me up. And I've tried to connect with all the alumni from the law school in the Bay Area that I can. And it's a nice connection to have. And, I actually, not that I think I'm good at fundraising, but I spend a lot of time trying to help a lot of different organizations. The National Judicial College I mentioned to you, you mentioned earlier, a group I served on the board of for 6 years. I'm very devoted to their mission and their goal of educating judiciary, because I think that's part of our, our civic society, to have an educated judiciary. And so I try to help them. I work for the Heart Association Go Red for Women campaign, trying to raise the awareness of women of cardiovascular disease as a high risk factor for women. And so again, I guess I think people have to do what they can to make the society what they want it to be. And so there's you learn a lot from these different touch points you have. I think state institutions many were late to the party as far as developing that culture of philanthropy that some of the private, universities that have the big endowments. And so we just have to work harder to create that if we want to have a kind of a legacy for other people. But I think people can do whatever they can. You don't have to always give money or big money. If you get involved or, be a supporter and a champion, I think that's good. Just important to remember what got you where you were, where you came from.
Very important, very important. And I know for years, every stump speech that I heard during many Dole presidential campaigns, he talked about always remembering where he was from. And that was a lesson that I always remembered too.
Sure.
And it's an important thing. It's an important thing because that's how you became who you are. Is where you started.
Well, it is the Midwestern roots. I always talk about being from the Midwest as being, the heart of America. The corporate board, which has been a real interesting opportunity to me because it's a bit like sitting on the other side of the table. Before I spent all these years trying to advise the board on what their responsibilities were and how to do their job and the things they should be considering. And now I'm on the other side trying to do all those things that I used to try to tell other people to do. And so that's been a real good experience. So I'm very happy about that, although the particular company that I serve on, which is a Houston-based insurance company, is now going to be acquired. And so I'm thinking about seeing if I can figure out another way to find a good fit to do another corporate board somewhere down the road. And so I think I'll be dabbling for a while longer.
Well, I think your career and your life is fascinating. Is there anything that you'd like to end on before we open it up to questions here?
Well, I don't. We talked a little bit about what would my advice be. I try not to give advice because most of it is unsolicited, and even then it might not be wanted. But I've tried to share a few stories about the things that have been, I think, impactful for me and helped be my guidelines in life. And I don't have any parting comments except I'm happy to see all my friends, old friends and new friends here, and thank you for coming. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be around.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I know Claire has a question, I can tell. Oh,
no.
Christina, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll take the floor.
You'll take the I figured she probably had herself all queued up. Who has the first question?
Hi, Lydia. Thank you for coming today. You talked a little bit about self-doubt, and a lot of women have self-doubt, and we overanalyze things before we apply for them. At the heart of that is probably the fear of failure a lot of times. Can you talk about maybe an example of when things didn't work out as you had planned and what I call a successful failure, something where you learned?
Yeah, well, that's a hard one. You always have to look at failure as a opportunity to learn. Well, What are good examples? I mean, I do think I spent a long time moving to different jobs, trying to find an upward pathway, and some were better than others, I suppose. I've spent some times. There were definitely times when I was thinking of leaving Chevron, thinking that I needed a better opportunity somewhere, but I'm not sure what. I don't know. Let me think about that. I'm sure I've had a lot of failures, so I must hide them. I was on the KU debate team, and I debated for 3 years, and I didn't debate my senior year, and one of the reasons was because I thought the coach should have put me on the #1 team, and he didn't. But he kept me with a woman that I had debated with for a while, who I thought, we were very compatible and we did quite well. But we were never going to be the #1 team because I was pretty convinced that two women could never be the #1 team at a university in those days, and it was even difficult for a co-ed team. It was very male-oriented. But, the thing that I did when I decided not to debate is I got this wonderful job as a television news reporter at Channel 4 in Kansas City, WDAF, and I actually got to be an on-air reporter, and so in a way, I thought I ended up with a better experience than I might have with another year of debate. So I don't know if that's a good example, but it does come to mind that it was that was a real unique thing, and I still, down in the attic, I still have those reel-to-reel tapes of being an on-air reporter, but
nothing to play them on, right?
No, nothing to play them on. Nobody's ever seen them since then. That's another interesting thing. I majored in broadcast journalism, and I thought a lot about trying to get a job. I stayed in law school primarily probably because I didn't want to grow up yet. But I did apply for a job at that TV station, and they didn't give it to me, and they told me that I had to cut my hair, which was very long and straight in those days, and get rid of my twang before I could be an on-air reporter. And I actually worked on the twang quite a while, but I found that offensive, that it was all about how you appeared on TV and not about whether you were a good reporter, because I was quite sure I was very good. So I didn't follow that career. I didn't get to be, a Barbara Walters knockoff, but I did get to go to law school, and so, I don't know, it's just a different path.
If it makes you feel any better, I know that some of the last few teams on KU's debate team that have been the top team have been both female teams. So
dynamite. I do.
Yeah,
I am glad to
excellent.
hear that. I'm really glad to hear that.
Also, you were talking about appearance. So my question was, we all know that in the public realm, if you're running for public office as a woman, there are things that you have to do strategically different than men. You have to hold yourself different. You have to answer questions differently. You have to really play two different roles all the time. And I wondered if you could comment about how that is in the corporate world. Is there any instances where you did things differently because you knew that you were a woman and maybe one of the only women at your time in the corporate world?
I'm sure. I used to talk about how much time I spent tiptoeing around a lot of egos, I'll tell you that.
So it's no different than politics then?
No. Well, it's an interesting, that could be a really long-winded answer. I will tell you that I went through several transitions in life about that. When I was in high school, I was like I didn't think I was a nerd, but I'm quite sure other people thought I was. I know the few boys that asked me out were definitely nerds, but I was always sure I was right, and I felt justified most of the time. I did really well in school, but I wasn't very popular, and I actually decided when I went to college I could change that. And I went to college and I did change that because I had a fun side, and I could kind of tamp down my know-it-allism some. And I could, ramp up the outgoing side, and I had a lot of dates and was pretty popular, and I partied all, I had a great time for frankly, all 7 years I was here. And I had really learned, don't, there's a lot of men I really respect in this audience. I don't want this to sound too demeaning, but I had learned how to get along with men, and I went a long time along with that. I had and one of my bosses did me a favor one time. It was one of my tax bosses, and he told me, much to my dismay, one time that I hid my intelligence behind my flirtatious personality. Which I actually took great offense at. But after I thought about it, I thought, well, because that had actually never occurred to me, that I was trying so hard to be likable that I didn't appear intelligent. And I really hadn't dawned on me until that moment that it was one or the other in some people's eyes. And so I did kind of tamp down, try to get more of a happy medium. And so I do think, I do think that women have more to worry about how people interpret how you are. And I actually spoke at Golden Gate University recently, and one of the women came up to me afterwards and talked about the trouble she had with people misinterpreting, her wanting to learn more from them and asking her out. And I thought, well, if you want something to change something. So I don't know what it is, but you're going to have to figure out a little bit of something different than the way you ask your question. So I do think people still worry about that a lot. And you worry, and you hopefully less and less. At the law firm that I work at now, which is a much different group than Chevron, let me assure you. People are very much less rigid. I went to I got invited to this partners retreat in September, and I just laughed the whole time. I said, this is so different from Chevron. At Chevron, if they said business casual, if they told you to come to the dinner at business casual, you knew what everybody would wear. And the men would all have on slacks and a sports jacket and an open collared shirt. And the women would have a business dress on that was just not quite the most dressy, thing they had. And you went to that thing where they said business casual, and we were certainly the more dressy of the people in the room. And we didn't, everybody had on all different things. And so it's much less rigid, and hopefully the same goes for workplace behavior. But I worked at a very old school corporation where, you could, if you watched, you could figure out the behaviors that were going to be acceptable.
Lydia, it's been noted earlier how impressive it is that you've kept your close involvement with KU from 1,500 miles away. And as you know, we at the law school are very appreciative of that. I'm curious, since you've been 1,500 miles away and you can view KU perhaps with more objectivity than we can here, what thoughts long-term do you have on KU's role in the state, in the nation, and the world?
Well, I do think that it's hard to be Stanford or Berkeley or Yale if you're in Lawrence. I do think that KU's biggest strength is to be a strong regional school that prepares people well for the jobs and opportunities in the Midwest. You'll always have stars here that can get a job anywhere, and in any number of fields, not just the law school. But I think the bread and butter has to be trying to get good, strong students to prepare them well for the wonderful opportunities that are here. And so I think it's not really quite stick to your knitting, but don't be too grandiose in your ambitions. I think is more realistic and probably more acceptable to the people in the state that hopefully continue to provide some funding and support for KU. I don't know how much you're currently getting from the state legislature, but I hope it continues at whatever level or more than it is.
Pat, did you have something?
Well, this is awkward. I used to be a minister. I'm a retired Presbyterian pastor. And I guess I'm attractive. And then you are attractive. Now, you had trouble with that, with men not taking you seriously about what you were doing just because you're attractive? I had a really hard time with that, and I didn't know how to handle it.
Well, I do think that you have to, I mean, that's kind of what, in your question too, you do if you do have to think about how you convey yourself or how you present yourself. And I did, after that comment about my flirtatious personality, I took that to heart. I said, no, it's really, I want to be fun-loving. I want to be a nice person that people want to spend time with, but I don't exactly want to, having, been married by that time, probably 5-10 years, it's really not what I was trying to portray. And so I did that. But I guess in the corporate world, it's, when I went to work at Chevron, I had like 2 pantsuits. I think I had 1 dress. And I, bought a couple pantsuits because I thought they were in style at the time. And it didn't take but about a week or 2 at Chevron to realize that all the secretaries wore pants, and all the few women that were professionals had on a skirt suit. In those days, we had the Diane Feinstein, bow tie look. And so, of course, once I figured that out, I had to get rid of those pantsuits and get some more Guy-Fi bow ties. But, my dad used to say something like, look sharp, feel sharp, be sharp. But I did, it does occur to you that you have to look the part. If you want people to think you're a working professional or a lawyer, whatever, you have to look like one. And so I did believe in that. And I don't know, though, I was in California, and they really were, there were a lot of in those days in the workplace, there were a lot of off-color comments and a lot of drinking and after-hours drinking. But it was pretty, and there are a lot of Chevron couples in the day that started out with somebody else and ended up this way. But I don't know, that's when it kind of goes back to your Midwestern roots about what do you want in life, and are you going to stick with the one that brung you. But it's, I think that's right. I think you just have to be, be careful. I remember sitting at one tax, industry tax meeting and sitting at some bar, and I'm sitting on some couch, and some guy, from Exxon puts his arm around me, and I'm like sitting up straight. It's like, okay, well, I was, whatever signal I was giving off, I got to change that. I don't know. I don't really have any good advice, except you just have to navigate as best you can. We've made it this far. We're going to carry on. At some point, that kind of fades away.
Cody?
Hi, Lydia. Thank you. My question is, what advice do you have for a young person or maybe a recent college graduate who's trying to find a job for the first time today, where there is a ladder for them to climb and make a career out of their work? Thank you.
Well, you just got to be persistent if you're looking for a job. I think, I've told a lot of people that you can find a job in San Francisco, but you have to be persistent. And that at some point in time, people have to take the jobs that are available and hope to move from there, because I think that's one of the, I think your generation has a tough time because it has great expectations and not a lot of patience, and that's not really the working world that I'm very familiar with. And so you just kind of have to figure out where those two are going to meet. Actually, before I left Chevron, we were doing a lot of thinking about how to meet more the Y generation or the YZ generation, because our workplace was fairly clear to those of us that have been there a long time, and that it wasn't as compatible with what young people were looking for as it had been, 20 or 30 years before. But I think that it kind of goes both ways. You have to see if you can adjust at least to some extent about what's out there. But you got to kind of follow your heart, find something you think will be interesting for at least a year or two, and give it a go. At least you have nowadays. I think there's little to no negative aspersions cast on a person who changes jobs every year or two. That's just accepted now. I had a guy interview for me a couple years ago, and I was asking him about all his previous jobs. And I learned after a question or two that he was really proud of the fact that he'd had only 4 jobs in 12 years or something. And I was, from an entirely different point of view, thinking that he was a job hopper. So, it was a learning for both of us, I think. But I wish you well. I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding your way.
You mentioned something about, after-work activities and after-dinner drinks, and I know there are some people who are about to be young professionals or about to take on internships here, so do you have any advice for young people who find themselves navigating kind of the corporate world and who maybe feel obligated to partake in things that maybe aren't the best use of their time, but might be expected in the corporate culture, such as after-dinner drinks, if they're perhaps the youngest person there, where the rules might not be the same for everybody? Does that make sense?
Well, yes, kind of. I mean, I do think that, I mean, it was such a pervasive thing when I started, and I thought it was much less nowadays because people are so much more interested in a healthy lifestyle, and where people live is so much more dispersed. But I have to say, you have to think twice when you think it's a better use of your time, because one of the things I think that I would have benefited from learning earlier is that it wasn't all about just how hard you could work, and it wasn't all about the fact that whatever got you here was going to get you to the next job. At some point in time, relationships become about as important as anything out there, and I think that men figure that out earlier than women in many cases. And of course, workplace relationships in a lot of ways are easier for men because it's less of an awkward situation, and because everybody talks about sports, and so as long as you can talk about sports, you're good to go. And I would just, I would just encourage people to be willing to get to know other people, and maybe drinks are not the thing, but in other forms, or lunch is very non-threatening, and coffee, whatever. There's a lot of ways to get to know people and have a relationship, and maybe some of those things that you don't think are the best use of your time in the end might be a value add. So just be open. Don't be too rigid about it. And but again, my sons always talk about the Irish goodbye. If it gets to be a bad situation, you can always excuse yourself to the ladies' room and just keep on walking.
That's not the Italian goodbye, so I learned something.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know why, but they call it the Irish goodbye. Are you coming back? Sure. Well, thank you all for being such a supportive audience.
Well, I'm gonna end on one question that's been on my mind
That's not fair.
that I was remiss in asking earlier. So, Lydia and I are part of a political group. It's called the Lincoln Club of Northern California, and among our members are Charles Schwab and Condoleezza Rice and George Shultz, some very prominent Republicans. And Lydia is our chair-elect for that group, and I'm just curious because I'm not sure how this is going to work. So every year we do the spring seminar at Pebble Beach, and every year it coincides with March Madness. And every year I see you and Chuck sort of disappear to go watch the KU game whenever it's on. So how are we going to deal with that?
Well, that's a big problem. Pebble Beach or March Madness is one of those difficult choices in life that you're glad you have these wonderful opportunities. But it will be. It better be. If I'm going to be chair, it better be a year that KU's basketball team isn't quite at their peak. Oh,
well,
that'll be an opportunity.
Thank you so much, and everyone, if you give Lydia a round of applause, just please have her here today.
Thank you. Well.